Excuse me. Alrighty. Let's we'll jump in here. Alrighty. Okay, so today, a couple things just to talk about. I finished marking the midterm, so grades are up. So you should be able to see your grade. The average for the exam dropped a little bit by basically 0.09. So you're like right level with the first midterm, which is good. I often see a drop on second midterms, less so in the spring because different kind of student takes spring classes. But yeah, no real drop, like not statistically significant. So again, if you have any questions about the exam, the first one or the second one, you want to take a look at it for whatever reason, just shoot me an email. Like you can come talk to me after class as well, and I can just kind of look it over with you quickly. Either obviously today, Monday or Wednesday of next week. I'm not around tomorrow. I'll probably be around campus on Friday if you want to meet in person. If you want to meet outside of hours, I can do that. Like outside of campus, Zoom, I can do Zoom as well. I know some of you have jobs, and if you have a lunch break and you just want to go over it, do shoot me an email. And again, we can look at the first one or the second one. And I mean, we just have today and then Monday, Wednesday, and then the course is over, which spring goes really fast. So on the agenda today, I'm going to finish up looking at crime, and then we're going to look at youth and health. Now, if you downloaded the slides for youth and health prior to like 10 minutes ago, do go and download them again. Because what I did was I looked at them and I was like, yeah, I'm going to pare this back a little bit, and I changed it up. So basically now it's a much shorter kind of slide deck. And I've pared a lot of topics out just for the spring semester to focus on some more current stuff and stuff that I think is a little bit more interesting. And honestly, information that sort of came out probably in March, April. just to kind of look at things like mental health. So it's now mostly mental health focused. So yeah, if you downloaded it prior to today, even like, I just finished working on it about 11:30. Go and download it again. It'll be a little bit different. It'll be shorter. And if we kind of, I'll try to keep the pace not too blistering, but quick. Because if we get to it, I wanted to kind of end the class today, either starting or running all the way through a documentary that'll set us up for talking about youth and technology kind of next week. Okay, so, today hopefully nice and easy and you don't have to listen to me talk for 3 hours, which I know towards the, any time is hard and towards the end of spring is challenging. Okay, so any questions about any of that? Any concerns about the exam or anything like that before I jump in here? Nope. Okay, you shook your head no. Perfect. All right, so we kind of ended off last class we were obviously talking about youth and crime in the second half of last class after the exam. And then we ended off, basically talking about what happened in terms of kind of crime in the 1990s, is particularly in the US, but it extends to Canada as well. And basically, we talked about, particularly ending off talking about racial profiling and policies like stop and frisk that came out, it really started in New York and then kind of came out of that based on this, broken windows theory of policing, right? That you police minor crime in order to crack down on major crime at the end of the day. Okay. And yeah, I guess we ended up right here. This is the last slide we looked at. Obviously, the criticism was that it really targeted young people, right? And that makes sense. Criminal profile, the majority of crimes are committed by people, about roughly 14, 24, 15 to 25, depending on whose numbers you're using and which statistics you're using. And so police were stopping people kind of in that age range, right? They were also stopping a disproportionate number of minorities, people of color in New York. And again, there's kind of competing claims. One being that the police were racist, right, in targeting Black and Hispanic individuals. And then, others saying that, well, they actually were using statistical kind of models to say where's crime happening in New York City and positioning the bulk of the police force in those places. And those just happen to be Black and Hispanic majority neighborhoods. Even though, right, like if we look at New York, at roughly 14% of New York's population is Black. I don't recall off the top of my head which ones are Latino, Hispanic, but it's not as big as those numbers would suggest. Okay. So, in terms of drugs and alcohol and their kind of link to youth crime, there is a pretty strong link between drug and alcohol use and youth crime. And basically, often it's impairment, right? One of the things that using substances does when it comes to young people is it removes inhibitions, right? So that basically, kind of like we talked about with hookup culture in a sense, with crime, it's sort of the same thing, right? Normally, a young person might never kind of actually commit a crime, but if they are intoxicated or taking a narcotic, some of those inhibitions come down, and generally they're more likely to go ahead and commit any number of crimes, right? And this can be everything from, minor to major offenses, right? Everything from like common assault, right? Where you're, let's say, at a party, you're drinking, someone else is drinking, and your inhibitions are down, your emotional regulation is down, and you start punching each other, right? Sexual assaults. Obviously, alcohol often plays a role, in lowering people's inhibition, who might commit sexual assault, and often, placing victims of sexual assault in riskier situations with less situational awareness than they might otherwise have. So, commonly these crimes do take place in, milieus where you have substances on offer. Yeah, violence and offending, intoxication is the most common thing according to Brochu. And yeah, I mean, some of the crimes involving substances also involve obviously being intoxicated. So driving drunk or driving high would be the most common ones here. Public intoxication would be another one. And yeah, I mean, in the cases, especially with impaired driving, you'd have a drug recognition expert evaluation conducted on site, right? So a breathalyzer or another test. Or the provision of a fluid sample where they could check, levels of intoxication. Sometimes a blood sample, right? If someone is, they suspect that someone is intoxicated or has taken a narcotic, the police could request a blood sample be taken depending on what they think is going on. And yeah, I mean, generally, in terms of victimization of crime, when you're intoxicated or using a substance, you're much more likely to become the victim of a crime simply because you're less aware of your surroundings, you're less in control, right? You may simply be easier to target in those situations. So we often find that's a component of victimization. Okay, kind of a pretty common perspective and expectation that a lot of people have is that the kind of search for drugs, right? The young people trying to get either access to drugs by stealing them or stealing something they can sell or funds in order to purchase drugs is a common component. I mean, that doesn't seem to be super common, right? Outside of certain communities, right? When we're talking about street-involved youth, or homeless youth, depending on the terminology you prefer, they're the ones who commonly actually do commit crimes in order to get access to substances. So economic powerlessness, the more economically powerless a young person is, right? The more they are disadvantaged, the more they're poor or street involved, the more likely it is they'll actually turn towards crime so they consume some kind of drugs. Now, typically, the more economically disempowered they are, the less likely they are to consume really expensive drugs, right? So they're going to stick typically to the cheaper substances that are available, whatever those happen to be, and they kind of shift around over time. And generally, this is, again, a subcategory of young people that tend to offend. Most young people who commit some kind of crime are not looking for money for drugs, if we take the population as a whole. Okay, when it comes to involvement in drug crime, typically the most common ones that young people tend to fall into is drug possession or drug kind of trafficking, selling, possession with intent to distribute or distributing narcotics are pretty common ones, right? And this can happen in a kind of varying range of scenarios, right? And often the drug trade kind of moves through peer networks. So it could be, one young person, purchases drugs and then sells them to other people in their peer network. They become kind of the lowest rung of kind of the distribution network for drug cartels and gangs and criminal syndicates, or just passing it out to friends, right? These are pretty common. Intent to distribute is a pretty common crime. Possession, less common, right? Like a lot of young people will possess drugs, but they're only going to get caught with this, with either possession or distributing in cases of proactive policing, right? You're not going to generally know that someone has drugs unless you pat them down or search them, which means that the police are, either stopping people, doing street checks or, stop and frisk or carding. Or something of that nature where they're, using a broad definition of probable cause to search someone, or if they're actively sort of embedding, either themselves or criminal informants or confidential informants in kind of a community to try and see what's happening, and then they're, targeting specific people they know are distributing, right? But it has to be proactive policing because typically, both drug possession and distribution, they are crimes, they're what's called victimless crimes, right? In that, if you're possessing drugs, you're obviously consenting to it, so there is no real victim to the crime. And if you're selling drugs to somebody, you are consenting to sell them and they are consenting to buy them. So both people are kind of consenting parties. And so they're victimless. So it's only like nobody's calling the police over, a drug purchase typically. So yeah, enforcement typically only happens, in proactive situations where the police are targeting individuals either for search or, trying to kind of trap them or essentially watch them in some kind of way. Okay. Yeah, when it comes to producing and drug, like high-level drug trafficking, not something like possession with intent to distribute, like high-level drug trafficking, moving large amounts. It's only very specific youth profiles, again, that are going to be involved in either of those. And again, you're talking about, gang-involved youth typically, and street-involved youth to a lesser extent can be roped into both producing and trafficking drugs in different ways, right? They're extremely vulnerable populations. And obviously, if you're gang involved, you're much more likely to be kind of in the drug trade and in various kind of roles. So, producing meth or some other kind of substance, fentanyl, lacing things with fentanyl, not uncommon, but again, a very small percentage and a very specific kind of youth profile, not the population in general. On most drug, like when we talk about Canada, the Youth Criminal Justice Act encourages police generally to divert young people involved in drug offenses, especially those two, producing is going to get you tossed in jail, pretty sure. Possessing and selling or possession with intent to distribute. Most of those people get diverted out of the criminal justice system and given things like counseling, drug rehab, because a not unsubstantial number of those selling drugs are also using substances. And often community service or some kind of other probationary sentence. Okay. In terms of possessing drugs and alcohol, obviously we only get a kind of tiny slice of the actual offenses, right? Because most of the times these are status offenses. Young people can't possess any kind of narcotic, whether it's legal or not, if we're talking marijuana, or alcohol. And then obviously all illicit substance possession is illegal, but we don't actually get much of it, right? It's what's sometimes referred to as the below the kind of waterline or the dark figure of crime, because we don't see most possession unless there's some reason the police actually kind of proactively catch you. So we don't actually have a really strong sense of how many young people possess substances. Sometimes we do kind of self-report surveys where people are asked, have they used drugs in the last, 12 months? But even then, those tend to suffer from social desirability bias. Any substance use involves young people in criminal or delinquent behavior, right? Because young people are not supposed to be drinking, they're not supposed to be using any kind of substance. And generally, possessing these substances is accompanied by other rule breaking or deviant behavior, using a fake ID, buying drugs from a drug dealer, all of which is a crime, theft, hiring bootleggers, all of these things are a crime. So, generally, if you have alcohol or drugs and you're underage, you've already committed some kind of crime in order to get those substances. So generally, again, most of this goes, kind of below the radar of the police and any kind of real figure of crime. Okay. Like I said a second ago, most kind of drug behavior and drug selling tends to be kind of through informal networks. Most people, will buy drugs from someone they know or an acquaintance of someone they know, right? And drug networks are distribution networks are fairly diffuse, right? One of the things that the criminal syndicates involved in the drug trade are really good at is sort of spreading out distribution along a lot of nodes. Essentially, so it's harder to kind of catch people. It's harder to kind of move up the chain, because people may not know who they're getting it, what the ultimate source of the drugs is. Peer connections tends to be one peer in kind of peer groups or kind of friends of friends who has some kind of connection to the drug trade that is the point of distribution, and they're getting it through, another network. Peer connections, in terms of youth selling drugs based on peer connections, it used to be largely related to cannabis, right? That was the most common substance. Now with the legality of cannabis is still part of that illegal distribution network to youth, because obviously youth can't buy it legally. But there's other kind of points of getting cannabis. And we've seen other substances sort of starting to kind of dribble down into youth populations, synthetic drugs, mostly things like ecstasy, but increasingly other things laced with fentanyl, just because obviously the drug trade is reliant on a client base, and the legalization of marijuana cannibalized a part of it onto the legal side. Yeah, generally, like dealing harder drugs or dealing outside peer networks is more common, in terms of habitual offenders, people who are going to become career criminals, and street-involved youth. Obviously, those that are really, really economically disadvantaged and vulnerable are going to be the ones that end up, dealing things like fentanyl, like cocaine, like heroin, like meth. Those are all the drugs I know. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, you can generally youth can either be working with adults, that's most common, or on their own producing and trafficking drugs on a large scale. Working on their own is pretty rare, right? Especially once we get into harder drugs like cocaine, or heroin or meth. Fentanyl, right? There's really complex global distribution networks for all of these things that tie back to, cartels in places like Mexico and other parts of the world, mafias, organized crime groups, like the Hells Angels. It's theoretically possible, that young people would be producing drugs on their own, right? But generally, it's part of a larger kind of organized crime syndicate. Usually young people who get involved in this are part of gangs, and those gangs are then kind of linked into other kinds of parts of organized crime as the kind of lowest agents on the kind of org chart, if you will. Gangs often, especially those that involve a lot of youth, often function kind of at the base with higher level kind of criminal enterprises running things. So like, the mafia, Italian mafia in particular, Sicilian mafia in particular, the Hells Angels, Latin American drug cartels are often kind of, running their drugs through gangs and using young people as, different parts of the drug trade, right? So there's lots of different things that they can do, right? Producing drugs, trafficking drugs, moving drugs around, distributing them, smuggling them across borders, right? We've seen really commonly young people from Latin America being used to smuggle drugs across the US border to get them into the United States. And then from there, into Canada and other places. I'm trying to think if there's other things. Generally speaking, the cartels, obviously in the last 20 years have become major players in this, the Mexican drug cartels in particular, and youth end up just being, again, at the bottom of the chart. They're disposable kind of labor for these big operations. And again, all sorts of ways they work. They distribute. Sometimes they do things like produce it, right? If they might be the ones working in a meth lab, or in fentanyl, kind of, using the base elements of fentanyl to then combine it with other drugs, or as, sitters, right? People who basically are put in a drug house and sit around kind of guarding it. And then obviously gang members who sell it. And generally speaking, most of them involved in the drug trade are also drug users, right? And this is, I guess for the cartels and other criminal organizations, this is a feature, not a bug. Ultimately, drug use is a good way of controlling people, right? If you then control their access to the supply of drugs, you control them in major ways. Alrighty. Okay, so gangs. Gangs, I keep spilling tea on my hand and it hurts. Okay, so gangs, right? Like I said, gangs play a big role. And one of the things we know about gangs, generally, when we talk about youth crime, this is what people want to talk about. And if you're interested, right, not next year because she's on sabbatical, but the year after, if you're still around, one of my colleagues, Marta Urbanik, teaches a whole class on crimes, and she's like an expert. Did her dissertation, has been working on gang research for like 15 years. Total expert, seriously interesting class, and you should take it if it interests you. When we talk about youth crime, gangs is often the one that gets the most attention because in a sense it's the flashiest, right? It's the one that is most kind of, people see as most relevant, and it's one that law enforcement speaks to relatively frequently, right? Law enforcement, police and prosecutors tend to like to talk about youth gangs, in part because it has in the past allowed them to get access to a lot of funds, right? If they can hype youth gangs in major ways, they can get access to a lot of money that they can then funnel into police budgets. Yeah, I mean, what does a gang look like? Generally speaking, we have a couple definitions here. I don't care for this one. This is from Tony Dube and Cicerone, which I think is a little bit too vague. Relatively stable, somewhat organized group with a clear formal leadership. That technically could be a hockey team. So I don't love that definition. I think Wortley and Tanner give a better one, right? And the key one being that they're engaged in illegal or criminal activity, right? Because if you're not engaged in illegal or criminal activity, you are a social club, not a gang. Leadership hierarchy, leaders versus followers, identifiable colors and clothing, right? Gangs mark themselves off and mark off their territory, right? So they have symbols and colors and things that are associated with them. Tattoos are a big one, right? Tattoos, specific gangs will have specific tattoo markings to show different things. And then, initiation rituals are important as well. Now, initiation rituals for most criminal enterprises involves the commission of some kind of crime, right? So generally, you have to commit a felony of some kind in the presence of other gang members as your initiation, right? This typically it proves you to the gang, and it gives them power over you, right? Because then they know about your crime and they can sort of sell you out on it at any particular point. Okay, I'm gonna play a short clip, which at some point I should probably replace because it's actually more hilarious than anything else. It's a clip from the show Riverdale, which I swear to God used to be good and now is absolute trash. But basically, this is a very stylized kind of gang initiation ritual. Generally, they're not this elaborate, and they're not this, in a sense, ritualistic. They're much more kind of on the ground, commit a crime, and then you get your patches or something like that. But here, let's have a look because it's funny.
Yes, sir. Let's see if you survive the initiation first.
What the hell? Your initiation begins now, with you assuming guardianship of the beast.
Kidding me.
So, what do you think of the beast?
Stinks. He barks all the time. He's got no boundaries.
Every new recruit has to take care of hot dog. It's tradition.
Someone needs to step up to keep an all-out war from erupting. I am taking this seriously, Tony.
So, from the top.
What is the fourth law?
No serpent is left for dead!
What is the fifth law?
A serpent never betrays its own!
What is the sixth?
In unity, there is strength!
In unity, there is strength! You know the laws. Now it's time for the next trial. Retrieve the knife.
Rattlesnake, Tony. A rattlesnake bit me and drew blood.
One that had its venom glands removed. Okay, the important thing is you showed no fear, you grabbed the knife, and you remembered all the laws. Which means you're almost a serpent now, Juggy.
All right, so this I think is fun because it's obvious that Hollywood writers have absolutely no idea what actual gangs do, which is super fun and is actually true of Hollywood writers in general. little life experience would probably flavor this, or read an article on gang behavior. But this is their stylized idea of what gangs do, beat the crap out of new initiates to a stirring pop ballad. Okay, so generally speaking, when we talk about gang violence and gang activity in terms of youth, Dubin and Cesaroni, and again, these are guys out of University of Toronto's Center for Criminal Legal Studies, basically suggest not a lot of increase in kind of actual youth gang activity. It's been pretty flat, for a couple of decades, but it sort of pops up and down in terms of media coverage, right? There's moments of sort of moral panics where the media will play up kind of youth crime or youth gangs in particular, and police departments tend, so the media tends to get a lot out of this in terms of clicks, right now, clicks or eyeballs in the past, right? People really are attuned to violence in their communities. And so the media tends to benefit, basically because it gets eyes on their content. Police departments, are complicit in this and tend to play this up a lot, because they know the media is going to eat it up, and because it often gives them a sort of reason to go before city councils or other funding bodies and ask for more funding. And so the kind of threat of youth gangs has often been kind of overplayed. And like in Alberta in the 1990s, there was a big panic around gangs, particularly around indigenous gangs and kind of East Asian gangs, Vietnamese and Filipino in particular, just because there was a kind of a big rise in media attention around gang activity. The police at the time in Edmonton, basically made the case that they needed gang units and new equipment to deal with the threat, which is precisely what council gave them at the time. Okay, so generally, how do gangs emerge? How do you get a gang, kind of a new gang kind of forming? This is typically kind of an American, Canadian model. If you look at somewhere like Latin America, it looks very different in some ways, right? So generally it starts with this, with a community, generally kind of poor socioeconomic status. And what happens is people start to sell drugs within that environment, right? Now, as it becomes profitable, this attracts more people, right? So if you and your friends start selling drugs, I'm not saying you would, but say you did, this might attract more people who see that you're making a lot of money, and this will lead to greater organization, right? Suddenly, you were just selling drugs, now you're in charge of 15 people, 20, 100, 200, you get greater organization, and you get a distinct kind of hierarchy, right? So you're going to get, a leadership class emerging within the gang, and then followers. And typically the leaders will start to, over a few years become older, right? Kind of emerging adults. And then, the kind of workers or distributors of drugs are going to be the youngest kind of members of the gang. Then, typically you'll get competition between gangs. Maybe this new gang that's emerging is muscling in on the territory of another older gang, and then you're going to get competition. New symbols start to be displayed. People start wearing gang colors and symbols openly. Tattoos are openly displayed and this sorts of thing. As they get more powerful, they get more public, right? And they start to take over public spaces. So they'll take over kind of schools and neighborhoods, right? Particular corners and areas of neighborhoods will become kind of owned by the gang, right? And everyone in the neighborhood will know, I don't know, this school is that gang's territory, and they sort of control what goes on inside. Or this corner belongs to this particular street gang. This city park belongs to this particular street gang. And you don't go near there, and you don't challenge it, right? And they gain control in communities. People start to get scared, right? And so law enforcement becomes less able to police because people are more scared of the gang than they are kind of willing to phone law enforcement or get law enforcement involved because they're scared of repercussions. And then that community will sort of deteriorate over time as the gang gains more power and, pushes out kind of legitimate sources of kind of pro-social attachment for, for young people in that community. Okay. I think this is the last slide for crime. Yes. Okay, so basically there are three sort of models that we can talk about when we talk about how people end up in gangs. And these are basically kind of mutually exclusive, right? So basically these are three different thoughts about how people get involved in gangs, and they don't necessarily jive together. So think of these as three separate possible paths that scholars think are how people join gangs. Okay, the first one is what's called the selection model. And basically in the selection model, right, someone is already involved in crime, right? They're doing something. It may be distributing drugs, it may be, break and enters, or any number of kind of small, typically pretty petty crimes. And basically the gang looks for individuals who are already kind of displaying antisocial behavior, graffiti, it could be any number of things. And basically picks those people and recruits them into the gang, right? So gangs are actually selecting youth that they see as vulnerable in order to bring them into the gang and increase their kind of enrollment, right? So that's the selection model. The facilitation model, right? Basically suggests that people who become affiliated with gangs for a number of possible reasons. It may be for safety, right? It might be, in this particular community, you may have lost kind of functioning structures of law and order, right? Gangs are powerful, and people who are not members of gangs could be at risk of violence, right? People may be pressured to join gangs. Fatherlessness might be there, so people are looking for some kind of attachment. It's a lot of different reasons that people might join a gang. And the facilitation model suggests that basically once someone is recruited into the gang, then they begin engaging in criminal activity, right? But basically it's like, okay, we've recruited you. It can be for any number of reasons, right? There are cultural reasons, structural reasons, safety reasons, social capital and cultural capital reasons, right? If the most sort of evident and powerful force in a particular neighborhood or city or whatever, or community happens to be a gang, right? People will tend to gravitate to it to connect with, that social network. And gangs are social networks in some way. And then, basically the gang, because it's a criminal enterprise, will then push people into committing crimes, right? And often, very near the beginning, your actual initiation into the crime is, committing a felony. I mean, so it's not necessarily true of a youth gang, because the Hells Angels and other biker gangs aren't youth gangs necessarily, though they do have youth involved. But one of the things, if you ever hear, people talking about the Hells Angels, they'll talk about someone being a full patch member of the Hells Angels. And basically, they have the jackets with the Hells Angel patch. Before you commit your felony, right, before you go through the initiation ritual, you can wear a jacket, but it has a partial patch on it, right? So it typically will have something like the location where you are, but not the full logo and name Hells Angels, right? So you would be a partial patch or half patch member of the Hells Angels, meaning you haven't, been fully initiated into the gang. And gangs are like this in general, right? You would get your full kind of colors, or you would get a tattoo once you actually enter the gang and commit that felony, right? So that's the facilitation model, right? You start out probably not involved in crime, and then because you become involved with this group, then you transition into criminal activity, and it typically an escalating pattern, right? Start with something relatively small, and then move up the ladder. Okay, and then the enhancement model basically says that joining people who join gangs are typically those already engaged in some kind of deviant or criminal behavior. And what will tend to happen then is it escalates, right? So you might have been, selling small amounts of a substance, I don't know, let's say marijuana, although it's not illegal anymore technically in Canada. Started selling a small amount of ecstasy or marijuana, right? You were doing this kind of on your own. You go into the gang and then you escalate, right? Then you're selling meth or fentanyl, and then you're, involved in, shootings or something like that, right? That the pattern basically goes from minor crime, recruited into the gang, or gravitate towards the gang, and then an escalating pattern of criminal behavior from there, right? Difference between those, right? Facilitation model typically says most people were not committing a crime before they started. The enhancement model, they were. And then it just escalates. But both of these would suggest an escalatory pattern. The selection model would tend to say, people will go into a gang, they were already committing crimes, and they'll keep committing those same crimes. Okay, how are we doing? So that is all we have for crime. So I'm just going to pull up the next one here. So I've largely rejiggered this over time, and just as kind of, I guess I will say, partially as a structure of my own kind of what I'm interested in terms of youth and health. And it has tended to be in the last few years around broad patterns of mental health and their connection, and not, I would say, in a necessarily psychological way, in a much more sociological ways. Like, what are the trends in mental health, and what are the potential kind of social causes of it? And so, I used to have a lot more in this unit about other things like, eating disorders and body image. And I think, those things are interesting, but I've sort of been phasing those out over time to focus more and more on kind of mental health and youth, and especially as it relates to technology, and social media in particular, because this, in a lot of ways, is what interests me the most. So we're going to talk here, about youth and kind of mental health, and I think this will give us a nice little transition into the last part of the course, which is all about kind of three views of technology and its effects on young people, and we'll kind of go from there. Okay, nobody's using it, but if you want to, you can ask questions through that. Okay, so here I want to bring another bunch of research. Here, I'll go back for a sec. A bunch of research, again, from that same institute that did Faith Unbundled on the religion unit, which is Springtide Institute. Because they did, their kind of look at youth and religion, which is how I encountered this research in 2022. And the whole report ends up, that they wrote out of it, ends up being about loneliness and kind of mental health amongst Gen Z, right? Okay, so a couple of things. So they start the kind of introduction to the data by kind of going through and looking at some of the research that's already been done on this kind of subject. So a 2018 study out of Cigna Group, basically that looked at 20,000 U.S. adults 18 and older, identified loneliness as one of the core things that the Gen Z cohort of that, and that's small, out of that 18 years and older, the Gen Z portion was still pretty small, but loneliness was something that Cigna identified as a real problem, right? Suggesting that, Gen Z was the loneliest generation in the sample when you measure it using things like the UCLA Loneliness Index. So if you ever come and take Intro to Social Methods with me, one of the pieces of advice I'll give you is when you're conducting a survey, instead of creating your own sort of survey questions to measure something like loneliness, you go to a tool that's existed for a long time and that has a long track record and is being constantly improved. The one that we talk about with loneliness, it was originally designed for seniors, is what's called the UCLA Loneliness Index. Obviously, it comes out of University of California, Los Angeles, and everybody kind of uses it. So looking at this, right, looking at questions that they use from the UCLA Loneliness Index, Cigna found, Gen Z, the loneliness, and when asked mental health questions and health questions in general, they said they were in worse health than older generations. Now one of the things that Springtide kind of brought out of this research, what I think is interesting, is that social media use alone was not a predictor of loneliness, that basically those who were heavy users and those who never used social media have similar scores. Now, why? Okay, why would this be? Well, there's one of the potential reasons that's offered by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, who's sort of one of the experts on social media and works a lot with Jean Twenge. And a lot of the data I'll show you in a sec comes from Jonathan. Is that social media now, it gets blamed for a lot of things. And if we don't see a difference in this data, what he suggests is that because social media is such a prevalent force in society, it's going to have effect on a population level, whether or not you really use it, right? So you might be, not be a heavy user of social media, but all of your friends are. And so whatever effect it's having on them is probably going to happen to you as well, simply because it's now dispersed through the whole society. And this is pretty common with technological changes, right? Like, I don't know, maybe not the greatest example, but I'll use it anyway. If you go back to, the Industrial Revolution, You had groups of people that were still artisans, still trying to make, high quality handcrafted goods in an industrial age. But like everybody else, industrial technology affected their lives, whether they were using it or not, right? It made them less competitive. It made things more, cheaper, so their prices had to compete. Technology tends to be diffuse, so whether you use that technology or not, it's going to affect your life in kind of major ways. Anyway, that's Jonathan Haidt's kind of take on it, and I think that probably makes sense. Okay, so loneliness rising, especially with Gen Z. Okay, one of the other, and probably one of the, I think, things that contributes to this is declines in kind of trust in institutions, participation in institutions, and such. And this sort of, Springtide brought out looking at research from Ford Motor Company. Now, I think this is amazing. Because these big brands like Ford and all these other big brands conduct market research to try and figure out what's going to happen with consumers in the future. And Ford Motor Company has, the person who does this and kind of brings this all together has the title that I want the most in life. So they are Ford's chief futurologist. And I don't know why, but the idea of being the chief futurologist for something makes me really happy. And, if anyone ever asks me, what do you want as a job title? I just want chief futurologist. That's what I want. Anyway, so basically a 2020 kind of national study conducted by Ford identified loneliness. Now, okay, 2020, we are talking about kind of beginning of COVID, but identified loneliness as one of the most pressing issues, driven in large part by a declining trust and participation in institutions. And in decreasing trust in relationships with peers as well. So the kind of two places that you could find meaning and connection, in institutions and then with peers were both sort of declining according to this research, which obviously, if you don't feel like you can relate in institutions and, even in peer groups, that's going to cause problems. Okay, so Springtide wanted a little bit more of a kind of particular look at young people. And again, their research is all about religion. I kind of tried to parse out most of the religious stuff because we already talked about religion. But basically in 2019, right, so prior to COVID, so this is prior to COVID, so that's good because we're not going to get the kind of COVID effect in there. They did 1,000 surveys and 35 qualitative interviews, and they measured loneliness using the questions from the UCLA Loneliness Index. And basically what they found was Gen Z had high rates of loneliness, social isolation, and stress. And we'll look at all of that. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting and where I think, again, Gen Z is different from millennials and Gen Xers and boomers is in the way that they conceive of belonging. And one of the things that Springtide suggested was that in terms of belonging, they kind of struggled with the questions that Springtide was trying to ask, right? That basically, they asked where they felt like they belonged. And what kind of Springtide reported is that question doesn't make a lot of sense to Gen Z. It wasn't so much where, right? So when you're asking where, you're asking in a sense institutional questions. Do you feel like you belong at school? Do you feel like you belong in a religious institution or in a sports team or in a social club or at home? According to them, what Gen Z what was reflected in those qualitative interviews was that, belonging for Gen Z isn't the quality of an institution, but it's relational, right? It's all built in relationships. So it's something that you have with people, not institutions. People make them feel like they belong. Institutions are just kind of there and not something that Gen Z really feels like they belong to. So again, I think this sort of makes sense, with some of the other stuff we've already seen. Even like the Faith Unbundled stuff, which was from 1 year earlier in terms of Springtide's work. It's like they don't identify with a particular set of institutional measures. They're much more kind of attuned to personal and relational kind of ways of belonging. Okay. Now that said, this probably matters too because it means that they're not turning to institutions generally to find belonging, right? So they have their peer groups, and that's where and kind of mentors, but they're not turning to other places where people might have found belonging in the past. Okay, now, basically what they kind of found is, about a third of young people reported feeling completely alone much of the time, right? They feel completely alone. They feel like almost 40% feel like they have no one to talk to. 45% feel like no one understands them. Nobody knew them really well, and it's difficult to make friends. And they didn't find statistically significant differences. Again, this is the religion content I couldn't cut out. Those who attend religious gatherings didn't seem all that different. Now, this is what I'll say in my interpretation of this data and the way that they sort of frame this. If you had looked at, say, those who are like religiously devoted, you might have found something a little bit different. If you're just asking, generally those who attend religious services, you're going to have a diffuse sort of set of religious practices in there. So probably not. Yeah, they're going to look a lot like the general population, which is sort of like what Smith and Denton found, and Smith and Snell, right? In terms of religion, you only saw the really strong effects of belonging and social connection amongst the devoted. If it was the general, the sporadics and the regulars, right, you didn't see much actual kind of benefit there for the most part. So the way that this is framed is interesting, but I suspect if you dug into the data in a different way, and I asked them for their data and they said no, because I wanted to run the statistics myself, but apparently it's proprietary and they want funding, so. Unless I can become one of their associates, which I can't because they only hire American associates. I also asked. I don't get access to the data, which is fine. Okay. So you can see kind of loneliness. No one understands them. No one really knows them. It's hard to make friends. Pretty significant, like all in minority territory. Oops. But still, like a pretty good chunk of Gen Z has these sorts of feelings, which is concerning. Okay. So, young people, again, this is all UCLA Loneliness Index kind of questions. Basically, if we look at kind of always or sometimes people answering these questions, this would have been a scale where basically people were asked to, how much do they agree with this, that it's true always, sometimes, seldom, never is probably the scale. So that they have nobody to talk to. So almost 40%, felt at least sometimes they had nobody to talk to. 40-ish% said they felt left out. 31%, so not as bad, almost just a little bit less than a third, said they felt their social relationships were superficial. This one I always think is interesting. Almost 40%, 38% said people are around but not with me, and they feel isolated from others, 35%. The reason I think this one's always really kind of interesting is specifically because this was sort of predicted in a book called, what was it? Oh, I don't know where my pen is. Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. So Robert Putnam, very famously wrote this book called Bowling Alone, where he basically said, one of the things that's increasingly happening as people mediate their interactions through technology is that those activities that people used to partake in together, it's like, and even a social activity, people partake in kind of alone because everybody's on their phone and they're distracted half the time. Sherry Turkle, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the course, next week, wrote a whole book called Alone Together about basically college-age students and about how so many of their interactions are managed by technology, that they are together, right, in physical spaces, but often also feeling like they're very alone because they're all hooked into devices all the time. So, we see that, a lot of, again, about a third to 40% of young people feeling, some degree of isolation and superficiality in their relationships. Okay, so this one I do think is interesting, and I find it a little bit harder to parse because of, the biggest chunk here is so this is like number of meaningful social interactions in a day. So obviously that 9%, so almost 1 in 10 young people say that they have no meaningful social interactions in a day. Super concerning number, right? 66% said they had between 0 and 3, right? So 57%, the 1 and 3. Now, this looks like a really bad number. And I feel like, my kind of panic sensors go off a little bit when I see this. But also I have questions as to what's inside of this 1 to 3. I think obviously it would be better if people had, between 4 and 5 or 5 plus meaningful interactions in a day. That would be ideal. 1 in 3, how bad is that? 1 is probably not great, right? That probably means they're having some kind of interaction either just with one friend or a parent. So not a ton of meaningful social interactions in a day. 3 could be okay, right? 3 meaningful interactions in a day is maybe not terrible. So within that number, there's a lot of stuff hidden. However, the fact that, basically 2/3 of young people have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions in a day suggests that there's a lot of young people in there somewhere that are probably very, very lonely, right? That are feeling like they aren't connecting with people in a meaningful way on a very regular basis. So there's a lot of superficiality, or just they're not well connected with people. Okay. Okay, so stress, loneliness, and anxiety. These numbers are all I think, concerning as well. 58% of them of the young people surveyed said they felt stressed and overwhelmed overall, right? Now again, high school, adolescence and emerging adulthood is a stressful time, right? There's a lot of things happening, school, peer relationships, changing kind of roles. It can be a very, very stressful time. 2/3 said, in terms of time crunch, they felt like they didn't have enough time to get everything done. And I think we should hear echoes of that maybe in the research that Donna Freitas kind of presented on hookup culture, right? One of the reasons that young people liked hookup culture was because they felt like they were too busy for relationships, right? They didn't have enough time to get everything done. And so if they were going to have, sex, they needed to fit it in an efficient way, right? So, 2/3 of young people said in this sample, and 1,000 is a pretty good sample, they didn't feel like they had enough time to get everything done. 60% feel fatigued or tired even when they wake up after an adequate sleep. Sleep is a big problem for Gen Z, and it seems in a large part, from what we could tell, to be driven in a lot of ways by smartphones, right? People are on smartphones late at night. They're getting, especially teenagers, are getting messages into the night, right? People are hitting up their phones with notifications and all that jazz. And more than half said they had a hard time feeling relaxed. 1/3 of them, right, 35% said they felt like they had no one to turn to when they're feeling stressed. And yeah, many of them said that stress and anxiety got in the way of forming meaningful building connections and belonging, right? So they were so stressed out, or they were exhibiting symptoms of anxiety, which meant they were having trouble reaching out to people and forming meaningful relationships. So bad all around. I don't want to belabor these too quickly. Young people's trust in institutions. Basically, this is a score out of 10. So only one of these institutions, right? So they have nonprofit organizations that score 5.3 out of 10. So basically, just a bare pass in terms of young people's trust in institutions. Public schools and banks, for some reason I can't fathom. Banks are not trustworthy, especially in the U.S. But banks, scored 50%. Everything else, organized religion, the media, the presidency, and Congress, that one's well earned. Politicians are not trustworthy. And big business all earned, that one's well earned too. All earned relatively low scores, right, in terms of trust. Trending towards no trust at all. Institutions where people could connect. Public schools, you're not connecting with banks, right? In terms of if don't belong to banks as institutions, right? Nobody ever said, let's all get together, all of us who are clients of TD Bank, and have a jam session. So in terms of institutions that people can belong to here, right? Maybe nonprofits and charities, public schools, and then organized religion. Generally, they're trending just around 50% in terms of young people who trust them, which is not a very good score. And yeah, trust in institutions, you can see, has been kind of dropping for the most part since the 1970s. Big business only dropped a little. The medical system went from 80% to 36%. I'd be curious to see if they ran this again today, because obviously, like I said, this is 2019. What would happen after COVID? I'm not sure. The presidency... This will be during the Trump years. So obviously, the well-earned... But they didn't trust the presidency over much in the 1970s. And even worse, by 2019. probably well-earned as well. Television news, sure, that's a well-earned decline. Congress, right? So government, like from 42%, which was not great, to 11% in 2019, which I think is fun. And, across the board, public schools, bang, banks down 30%, and organized religion, down from 65. So obviously that's a big one, right? Down to 36%. So it's hard to say, like, if this is the level of kind of trust that people have in these institutions, where are they going to find, connection and meaning on an institutional level? It's not surprising they don't think of belonging as being something that happens in institutions. Okay, so this one, sorry, they didn't release this as a digital copy that I could use, and I usually buy their digital books so that I can then screenshot them on my tablet. And they didn't do that because I don't know why. Probably so people couldn't do what I'm doing and steal their beautiful graphics. Because they do really nice visual work. They're whoever their kind of graphic designer is, I tip my hat to them. Okay, but basically, trusted adults. This is one of the things that they kind of cued in on in terms of trusted adults, right? So, big shifts. So you have 4 kind of categories here, right? I feel completely alone. No one understands me. I feel left out, and I feel stressed and overwhelmed. And what you can see is, right, when you have 0 trusted adults, those numbers are all sky high, right? Feel completely alone, 62%. No one understands me, 70%. I feel left out, 59%. So all of these are in not only majority territory, but big majority territory. And then I feel stressed out and overwhelmed at 3/4. When you get those numbers drop as you get more connected with adults, right? So this again, so 5, when you get down to 5+ trusted adults, you're down, I feel completely alone, only 9%. No one understands me, 1/4. I feel left out, less than about 1/5. And then I feel stressed or overwhelmed. So obviously things are stressful. So still about 40%. Connections with adults really, really seem to matter. And if you remember from the religion research, that was one of those things, right? One of the things that Smith and Denton pointed to as being one of the reasons that those very religious teenagers thrived, right, was network closure. Network closure and the number of caring adults they had in their lives, right, which was significantly higher. I mean, Smith and Denton's research put it in the 8, I think I wrote 8.4 for the most religiously devoted. That on average, right? So way more than 5, right? Yeah. So basically, adult connection really matters, right? And this is one of the things I think Smith and Denton stressed, which I don't think I mentioned, or maybe I mentioned at the beginning of the course, I can't remember. Young people, teenagers, emerging adults, in a lot of ways, they suggest, still need a lot of mentorship, right? They are still figuring out life. And a lot of, they still need those important adult connections that guide them through life, help them deal with situations, give them advice, help them feel connected. The more of that they have, right, the better it is, right? Even 2 to 4 trusted adults, huge differences, right? In terms of 30% drops in no one understands me, 30% drops in I feel completely alone. How big of a drop? Not as big of a drop in I feel left out. That's more of a peer question in a lot of ways. And stress declines, right? So adult connection remains really important to young people's feelings of loneliness, right? So when you have this, it looks like a much better picture. And I think that's, for me, this is the most interesting thing. It lines up, I think, really well with other things I've said in the course, right? With Smith and Denton and Smith and Snell's research on kind of the thriving of especially religious young people, right? We see a lot of this same kind of thing coming, even though this question doesn't look at religion at all. It just looks at, connection to trusted adults, right? The more there is, 5+, the better it is, right? And it's less than 1/5, right? 17% that have 5+, 52% have 2 to 4. So, the majority of young people are in these 2 categories, which is good. 1/4 are there, and 8% are at the top, or sorry, 1 trusted adult, and 8% have none. So you're looking at 31%, basically about 1/3 that are pretty disconnected, and therefore are at kind of risk in that way. Okay, And I mean, just to kind of, again, show you the difference between especially that 0 trusted adults and the 5 or more, severe loneliness and social isolation is substantially reduced by increasing the number of connections young people have to trusted adults. Now, again, this is a challenge, if we look at, we sort of have a perfect storm here in terms of disconnection and worldview. When you don't trust institutions, it's hard sometimes to make those connections with trusted adults, right? And especially once, you transition from teenager and in high school into emerging adulthood, this is going to get more complicated for people who are into that, university era, where it's less organic in terms of both peer and adult connection, right? Because professors, people like me, don't interact with young people on the same level as high school teachers do, right? Tends to be still a lot of young people, but a little bit more personal. It requires a much different approach. And if people are generally disconnected from other institutions, right? And this is like social clubs, political parties, NGOs, places that they volunteer, religious organization or organized religion. There's a lot of potential loss there, because if you're not participating in those places, connecting with adults is going to be a lot more difficult. So the deinstitutionalization and loneliness, I think, tend to go together in major ways, and is potentially, I think, really contributing to those problems for young people. Okay, doing okay so far? I'm trying to go fast because I want to make sure I have enough time for this documentary. But is that all making sense? Okay, perfect. I see nodding. So I want to jump in. I got a lot of charts. I'm really sorry. I should find my pen. I can't find it in my bag. Did I put it back? Oh, I put it back where it belongs. Okay. Unlike me. Okay. Hopefully it works. This has become super good language there, Broussard. This has become a big concern, especially following COVID, right? Mental health concerns were already a big concern prior to COVID. We'll talk about Jean Twenge's book, iGen. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the course. We'll dig deeper into it next week. We're already seeing really big concerns with youth mental health prior to COVID, really starting around 2015 to 2019. People were asking a lot of questions about what was going on with young people. And 2021, you had this study from Twenge et al., which includes the guy I just mentioned, Jonathan Haidt, looking at kind of adolescent mental health. And basically what they found was that everywhere that we were kind of measuring adolescent mental health, in really statistically robust ways, we're seeing basically from about 2010 forward, pretty steep declines in adolescent mental health worldwide. All developed economies are kind of seeing the same patterns of declining adolescent mental health. Now, this all started before COVID, and then COVID seems to have taken what was already in the lockdowns and the isolation and Zoom school and all that jazz that we all had to live through, took what were already existing social trends, right, things that were already happening, and sort of sped them up in some ways. Now, the effects are differential by sex, right? So we see that they're affecting both males and females, but most of the effects are more pronounced in females. And I'll show you the charts in a second just to kind of, see what it looks like. But generally, females have been worse affected by whatever these trends are. Now, there's a big argument going on in the social sciences right now, and Twenge and Haidt and a bunch of others are sort of on the social media smartphone side. Like, what's the cause of this? It's social media and smartphones. There's other people that are looking at the research and suggesting they're less confident that this has to do with smartphones and social media. Now, my cards on the table, I find the arguments against. So I find Twenge and Haidt's arguments that social media and smartphones are probably the dominant cause pretty compelling, and I find the kind of counter side really weak, right? It's sort of like, it tends to me to look like nitpicking data right, and nitpicking kind of regression models to find like little kind of errors in them. And I do tend to think that Haidt and Twenge are right. So if I'm presenting what seems like a little bit of a, social media is bad, it's because to me the evidence looks pretty overwhelming, and I find the other side very nitpicky and not all that convincing. Okay, so yeah, generally there's a couple of culprits: smartphones and social media. You're basically doing two major things, right, which are these two, basically causing a decline in time spent with others amongst young people, and contributing to already existing trends of deinstitutionalization that were going on with millennials, but seem to have accelerated with Gen Z as social media has allowed them to at least find what they think of as a semblance of belonging online. And I remember this, I think the first time I taught sociology of religion at U of A, which actually was the first time I ever taught it, so the caveat there is not important. I remember we were having this discussion in class, because it turned out it was a pretty small class. And, we're talking about kind of generational differences in religion and religious identification. And one student, I remember her name was Svetlana. I don't know why I remember that. Sat dead center. I don't know. Anyway, sometimes you see things in your mind and it's very clear. And she said, I understand why my grandma is religious, right? She goes to church. That's where all of her friends are. But I have social media, right? So I don't need that community because I have social media. Now, this led to a discussion, which I thought was pretty interesting, about whether you can replace in-person communities with online communities. Svetlana seemed to think you could. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical about that for lots of reasons. But let's get into the data, and then hopefully we can take a little break and then watch at least a good chunk of the documentary before we come back. Okay, so all of this was gathered by Jonathan Haidt. He kind of put all of this together in a bunch of posts on his Substack, which is really interesting and I think indispensable. He's basically putting together this Substack and he's as a way of like cobbling together a book he's writing, and he's a fabulous kind of social psychologist. If you haven't read his stuff, I highly recommend like The Coddling of the American Mind. Is a really, really interesting book. Okay, so, and he's a close associate with Twenge, and I love Gene, so it's just all around happiness for me. Okay, so what do we see, right? So basically this is taken from this, which is the Youth Risk Behavior Report for 2011 to 2021. This was the same survey, by the way, that I showed you earlier on sexual behavior amongst youth, right? Where it showed, those declines in number of partners, what age the young people are becoming sexual, how many of them have sexual partners. Right? We saw this kind of same data from the CDC in the US. Okay, so persistent feelings of hopeless. So anyone with the stop sign says bad. And basically what you see, again, is an escalating pattern of sadness or hopelessness in about a 10-year period, right? From about 2011 to 2021. A big jump in the number of young people saying that they felt, persistently sad or hopeless. The only time we had, experienced poor mental health, they only started asking the question on the 2021 survey, but about 30% said that. Attempting suicide, not huge jumps, right? We're talking about what, 6%, but still a pretty consistent pattern, moving from low to high. Made a suicide plan, again, not a huge jump, 5%, but statistically significant. Suicide attempts, pretty flat, which is good news. Only up a little bit, which is bad news. And we're injured they're injured in a suicide attempt that had to be treated by a nurse, basically pretty flat. Okay, so that's, kind of what it looks like. Again, from the CDC Youth Risk Behavior Survey, percentage of female and male students experiencing persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, increased. And basically you can see, right, that it, is this the same one? This might be a different survey by the CDC. But basically, for males and females, we see basically upswings for both and much more pronounced for females, right? But a bad trend in terms of feelings of sadness or hopelessness. And again, with all of the, I thought I had these on separate. Oh, I do. Okay, sorry. I didn't put each of these on their own. I'm like, did I put all of these on separate slides? I thought I lumped them together, and I thought maybe I have the wrong slideshow. Okay. Attempting suicide, right? We see the kind of trend again, rising precipitously for females, in a much more concerted way, pretty flat for males. So we see again, females more affected. And we'll talk about that, about the reasons why. Okay, now this is one specifically. So this comes from another study, American Time Use Study, right? So basically talking about how people use their time. And this one is interesting because it's striated by age, right? And one of the things we see kind of generally, right, for everybody in this study is that, starting about 2012, roughly, you see kind of steady declines in time spent with people. And, it had already been declining for adolescents in here, right, or adolescents and emerging adults in here. But then it kind of takes a really steep drop, and it takes the steepest drop here. It's not necessarily surprising because somewhere in there is COVID. But generally across the whole sample, across all age groups, people are spending less time with friends, right, in terms of minutes per day. And why? Well, okay. So why does it look like this? Okay, most people, right, when you're an adult, right, you get to be adult and it's not super fun. So below that line, you spend less time with friends generally because you work and you're busy, right? So once you exit kind of adolescence and emerging adulthood, you spend less time with friends, right? Because life patterns kind of change. You spend more time with your kids and your spouse. Now, adolescents have tended historically to spend a lot of time with friends because they're in school, right? And they're doing school activities, they're hanging out after school. But we see basically is that, really starting, in the social media era, which actually starts about here, right? About 2005 when Facebook comes around. But then really picking up in the smartphone era. So 2007, right about here is when the iPhone is released. 2012 is the year that Twenge notes out as the year the majority of Americans had smartphones. And by then, we're talking about 80% or 75% of teenagers and 80 or 90% of emerging adults overall. So what you have, is basically from 2012, kind of a consistent drop, and then COVID kind of, again, puts that on speed. So big drops in terms of time spent with people. We'll have to see, hopefully we get an update on the time use study and to see if there's a re-uptick after, COVID ends and maybe there's a recovery, but it looks pretty bad. We've gone from on average, spending about 150-ish minutes a day with friends, so a bit more than 2 hours for adolescents and emerging adults, down to less than an hour, right? Getting closer to 40 minutes. And even like prior to COVID, we're talking like half, right? You're talking, if you look here, that's about 2019-ish. You're still talking less than, a little bit more than an hour. So about, less than half of what it was at the beginning of the sample. So we're spending less time with friends. Okay, along with that, I'm doing okay for time. This is rare for me. Serious markers of mental illness are increasing, and they're increasing the most in the youngest part of our sample, right? So this is from National Survey on Drug Use, and this is National Survey on Health Assessment, right? So this is U.S. anxiety prevalence, and you see, right, again, a solid about 15% of 18 to 25-year-olds are basically diagnosed with anxiety. And basically, as you get older, the number goes down. And then, undergrads diagnosed with anxiety, about 20% from this sample. So we're looking at, 1 in 5-ish of U.S. undergrads, with a mental illness, anxiety, depression, is not great either. Yet so that's a quarter say they have anxiety, 1/5 say they have depression. And then, the rest of them are thankfully much, much lower and have stayed pretty much flat, except for ADHD, which has come up a little bit. So, anxiety is more prevalent amongst the young. And the speed at which it's grown, I think height suggests is probably not just reporting. Because the question that always gets asked is Gen Z just more attuned to this and more likely to report? The speed of growth, right, I think he's probably right here, suggests that there's probably part of that, but there's also probably just more anxiety in this kind of generation. And yeah, you're seeing, a lot of anxiety and depression. And it's grown significantly in a really short amount of time, right? 2008 to basically 2019. So again, this chart is handy in being prior to COVID, so we don't see the COVID effect. We're looking at steep growth, 234% growth of anxiety, and then what is it, 100? I covered it up, 186% growth in depression. So really fast growth. And I'm sorry, these are all really small because I wanted to fit them all on one slide. Okay, so what do we see here, right? So basically, self-harm, suicide amongst those 10 to 19 has grown, and these samples are sort of split up in funny ways. So we have 10 to 14 and then 15 to 19, right? But we've basically seen big increases, in self-harm for both, right? Up 37% for boys 15 to 19, up 43% for girls 15 to 19. And then, non-US teens admitted for non-fatal self-harm, so cutting or other forms of self-harm behavior, pretty significant chunk there, 188% increase basically since 2010. Boys less, a 48% increase, but it's still pretty low. And then suicide, right? Boys always, or males always commit suicide at higher rates than females. There's a lot of reasons for this. So we don't need to dig into it. But basically, we've seen growth amongst both. Percentage-wise, we've seen a greater kind of percentage growth, even though it's just slightly in terms of the 10 to 14-year-olds. And 15 to 19-year-olds is a little bit more, a bigger kind of percentage growth for girls. And this is concerning, right? Because girls used to be, in a lot of ways, much, much less at risk of suicide, much more at risk of self-harm, much less risk of suicide. But now things are evening out a little bit, right? And especially in this, 10 to 14, you don't want that gap to close too much. Okay. So how are we doing? Are you all sufficiently depressed now? I mean, you were probably, given these statistics, you were already depressed, so never mind. Sorry, bad joke, but I had to throw it out there. All right, similar trends. So that's the US. Similar trends exist in Canada, right? So we see a little bit different way of asking the question, right? So if we look at these charts, right, very good or excellent mental health amongst women, a pretty steady declining line, but from 2009, basically it drops off for 15 to 30-year-olds, and this is exceptional, right? Like, I do want to stress this kind of thing in sociological research is really rare. For something to drop like that, like bumpy lines, like kind of like this one, are much more common in social science research than big drop-offs, or what I would categorize this one, the very good or excellent mental health for women dropping, from what started around like 75% and drops down, closer to 50%, a 29% decrease. That's a sort of hockey stick shaped graph, right? For something to drop off like that, or in this case, a reverse hockey stick shaped graph. And that's pretty rare, right, in social science research. Usually things kind of bump and then decline or increase slowly. This is a big drop really quickly. Amongst men, you see a similar trend again, where, the 15 to 30-year-olds here dropped more, although the drops again are more pronounced in females than they are in males, right? And yeah, I mean, we see the hospitalization numbers. So this is only for Ontario. So we don't have a national kind of study to look at this. But what we see, right, is a big jump in hospitalizations for girls right around 2009, right? It actually had been going down. And then it jumps from 2009 to 2016, which is the most recent data we had. And I would suspect it's gone even worse based on other things I've seen. So more hospitalizations for self-harm, typically it would be the big one there. And then worse reports of mental health in general. Okay, the UK, similar trends again. And everything has these strong kind of male-female patterns. Right, so happiness trends, girls decline much faster than boys at about double the rate in the UK. So I mean, still generally pretty good, right? If you're talking about a score out of 10, 7.47%, but it's declined, from over 8. So a decent decline. Boys have declined half as much. So again, not affected as well. Anxiety and depression, amongst girls and boys has risen considerably. It's risen more in percentage-wise for in anxiety for boys compared to girls, and girls started at a higher baseline, but the trend lines look roughly similar. And then depression for girls risen pretty steadily, 137% versus 60% for boys. And then self-harm hospitalizations, we see a similar pattern, right? A big jump right around 2011. 2011, 2012, again, that's the year we get real deep in terms of smartphone penetration. And then kind of really hits up and then kind of levels out a little bit, which is good news. But we've seen a lot of self-harm hospitalization for girls as compared to boys, although boys have risen as well. And I think Australia, I could have done New Zealand too, because I have all the stats for New Zealand. But I'm like, who cares about New Zealand? Sheep. Still a country with more sheep than people, so let's not worry about it. But if you look at the New Zealand trends, they're almost exactly the same. This one's interesting because as far as I know, Australia was the only one that collected this data. Self-poisoning, so kind of suicide attempts, big growth in girls 15 to 19, so that's probably taking pills of some kind. So hospitalization for that. Overnight psychiatric emergency hospitalizations, for females, up 81% since 2010 to 2020. So again, we're probably seeing before COVID effects there for the most part. And less pronounced patterns for males, still up 51%. But for those 12 to 24-year-olds, the category we're interested in, but much lower and much slower than females. Self-harm hospitalizations for Australian females. It seems to have really peaked out, in 2017, and then kind of leveled off a little bit, but still a pretty good jump. And psychological distress, a 74% increase since 2010, and a big jump after 2012. Looks like about 2013, a lot more psychological distress. Okay, so generally mental health for young people across kind of at least the Anglosphere is not looking terribly good. Okay, one more interesting kind of piece from Height that I thought was kind of interesting. I just think is interesting, so I'll present it and then we're almost done. Politics seems to play a role in this, right? And what we have seen in general is much greater declines in kind of in mental health. So what do they say? That you have a mental health, people saying they have a mental health condition. And what do we see, right? So when we talk about conservatives in our kind of youngest category, right? Women and men, kind of lowish, 25, what is that? 20 and 10, 20 and maybe 12%. For political moderates, so people in the US who would report being independents, a little bit higher, but it just skyrockets, especially for, liberal women. And liberal men are still higher than, even moderate women in the same category. So politics seems to play a role in that. Depression scores by gender and politics, right? So female and male liberals, reporting much higher depression scores than female and male conservatives, which I think is interesting. Okay, one of the things that I thought was interesting when I looked at this was that there's two kinds of measures that they have here. One is what I would categorize as locus of control, and one of them that I would categorize as it's categorized by the charts as self-derogation behavior. So if we look at this middle chart, which I know is kind of small, I should have made it bigger. But basically what we see is kind of, whenever I try to get ahead, something or somebody stops me, and is this monitoring the future? Yeah, it's monitoring the future. It's got to be the way it's asked. I love American social science research more than I love almost anything, just because they have so many of these longitudinal studies. It's super interesting. Okay, so what do we see here, right, in terms of, kind of self-efficacy or locus of control. So basically what you're saying is if you think that when you're trying to get ahead, something or somebody always stops you, what you're doing is you're externalizing the locus of control in your life, right? You're saying that external powers, external things to my life are the things that are in control of my life, right? So what we see here is pretty high measures for external locus of control in liberal girls and conservative males, right? Both of whom tend to think that something is getting in their way. When we get to kind of conservative girls, lower external locus of control, they seem to feel like they're more in control of their own lives. And same thing with liberal boys, seem to think they're more in control of their own lives, right? So we see strong, like a strong sense in certain communities, and here it doesn't split conservative liberal, it's like liberal female, conservative male see themselves as having an external locus of control. Now, external locus of control is a big problem, and one of the things, like, if you ever do cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is like the gold standard of therapy, right? It's the only thing that really has a strong track record of working. One of the things that often happens when you're doing CBT is your therapist is going to try to shift the locus of control. If you have an externalized locus of control and you think the world is against you, they're going to try to shift that internally, right? So that you're going to start thinking not the world is against me, but more, I can affect the world, right? That my actions have meaningful consequences. So we see is at least some percentage of young people have this external locus of control. And that powerlessness will tend to lead to things like anxiety and depression. Because if you don't feel like you're in control of any part of your life, that's not a great feeling. Okay, the other one is self-derogation. Self-derogation, right? So liberals, kind of girls and boys, are more likely to express some combination of these things, right? Which is they don't have much to feel proud of, okay? Sometimes they don't think they're good at all. They feel like they can't do anything right, and they feel that their life is not very useful, right? So liberal girls or liberal males and liberal females basically reported this at a considerably higher rate than conservatives, right? So I think this is interesting. This probably goes down to political culture and the way that political cultures actually structure things like locus of control. It may be around things like, views of the self, views of history, views of your place in society. Certain political movements may play to a feeling that you don't have much to be proud of. Potentially that you're an oppressor or something, right? It's really unclear from this, but there seems to be something going on where people who identify as politically liberal, feel in some way that these kinds of statements match them more. And I had a student last semester who put in the comments like, wait, how did you get my diary entries and put them on the screen when I posted those 4 statements? So whatever this is, self-derogation is very, very bad. Because it tends, again, to be this thing where people have really negative view of themselves, and this is going to lead to a lot more anxiety if you think you have nothing to be proud of, if you think you're not good at all, right? Okay, and this is my last kind of slide here. I'm sorry, I didn't put any question slides in this last part because I modified this whole thing. So social media, and we'll explore this next week. We'll start a documentary here in a couple of minutes. Which will kind of hopefully set us up thinking about this. But yeah, we talk about, percentage of, this is again out of the UK. So this is, I don't know what study this is out. Oh, this is out of table 2 of Kelly, Zilla, Nawala, Booker, and Sacker, page 6. So probably a small research study. But basically, percentage of UK teen depressed as a function of hours per weekday on social media, and a pretty clear trend, right? There's still a good chunk of young people depressed who are spending no time on social media during the week. But as you go up, and it really seems to pick up after 2 hours, after 2 hours, it goes way up. Sorry, I love doodling. Basically what you see is more people depressed. So percent of UK teens, boys using, 5 hours or more of social media is about 15. Girls, you're trending towards 40. So does social media play a role? There's at least a statistical case to be made that, yeah, the more, and especially excessive social media use probably plays a role. Although when we're looking at girls, right, across the spectrum, still more likely to report than boys. Okay, sorry. Before I jump in, we'll take a break in a second. Any questions about any of that? Because I threw a lot of statistics at you. Hopefully it's interesting. Again, sadly, sociology of youth is a very depressing subject at the moment. Okay, why don't we take a break until 2:50? We'll watch a little bit of this documentary. There's definitely a question about this documentary on the final exam. So we'll watch it for the rest of the class, and then you don't have to listen to me, talk statistics and doodle on graphs. But yeah, we'll kind of watch that, and that'll set us up next week for talking about youth and technology as our final kind of set of units in the course. Okay, so we'll see you in a few minutes, and I will get that set up. Should I keep my doodles? No. Okay. Yes. Yes, I have it listed in my question bank as forced questions, so everybody has to answer that question.
Just like take notes.
Yeah, and maybe just take notes and kind of pay attention to the general themes. Yeah, no problem. Alrighty. Ooh, battery's almost dead. Turn the recording off.